all about APIs and Postman, and testing your APIs is one of my favorite things as well. And before I joined AIS, I was heavily involved in creating, maintaining, testing an API built with .NET Core, and then a lot of integration tests with Postman. So I'm kind of sharing some of my experiences using Postman, especially for integration tests after publishing an API to Azure. So I did try to set up a little team survey, but that didn't seem to work. And I was just kind of curious about your experience with Postman in general, maybe using Newman, if any of you have actually used it in pipelines, and whether any of you had experience building and testing RESTful APIs. But we will skip that for now. And we'll move on to a little bit about me. So this is a picture of my family in Kauai 3 years ago. I'm kind of on my second career. I was a former high school teacher and athletic director, and had a lot of times where I needed to program databases to keep track of student records and whatnot. And I started liking that a lot. So I actually got into programming and got out of teaching. So my whole family is a Penn State family. On the left in that picture is my son Caleb. He started at DreamWorks in LA, and he still is in Burbank right now. My wife Kendra, who works for Penn State and graduated from Penn State, and my son Hayden, who is currently at Penn State. I have 19 years of experience, various things, starting off with databases, Access, SQL Server, RESTful APIs, web development, and then later got into a lot of Azure integrations, and then DevOps. As I said, I love Kauai. My family loves Kauai. I've been there twice and can't wait to get back. And one thing that some of you know about me from the training I was in December is that I got to play golf at Pebble Beach for free. So this is a picture of my son Caleb and Hayden in Honolulu. Actually, the ocean is to their back, but what is beautiful about Honolulu is just the mountains in the background, and this is a good picture of that. And this is worth showing because this is me, and this is my friend Jared, who I worked with in at Energy Cap here in State College a few years ago. This was 2016, and Jared and I won a local tournament run by Audi, which got us a free trip to Pebble Beach. But also worth mentioning is that Jared is the one who got me to notice how well Postman works for testing APIs. At that point, I just used it sparingly for one-off little requests or whatever to test an API, but he showed me how to actually write the tests and use it more thoroughly. So I got to give him credit for that. Here's what I'm going to show you. I'm going to mention the demo API, and it's just an API using a function app because I wanted to just keep it very simple. How to use Postman to test an API, using Postman environment files and environment variables. How to write tests in Postman. I have some very simple tests. It can get very involved. You can chain tests together. So if you can imagine like setup and tear down of your tests where you're maybe creating a resource, you're updating the resource, and then you're deleting the resource. You can do all that kind of chaining in Postman. Then I'm going to introduce the Newman CLI, how you can run Postman tests from the command line. And then, of course, the goal of this whole thing is to show how you can use Newman in an Azure DevOps pipeline. And lastly, I'm going to show a demo of just the whole SDLC of, okay, I'm going to add something to my API. We're going to add some tests in Postman. We're going to check them into the repository, the whole deal. We'll do a pull request, merge, and then we'll see everything working, we hope. Here's the setup that you need. I'm using Visual Studio Code. In my previous job, I was always using first-class Visual Studio, but Visual Studio Code works great for actually running Newman from the command line too. So you could have your code there, you can run your function app locally, and then you can use the terminal to run your Newman tests. So there's an extension for Azure Functions that you need to install. You also need Node and NPM because the Newman runs on Node and NPM, so you need those as dependencies. There's also an Azure Functions core tools that you need. A prerequisite to that is .NET Core, at least 3.1 SDK. And then here's a link, and I have this in some of my references at the end too, how to get started with Newman. And then because Newman is an NPM package, you have to install that Newman package. So, once you have all the other prerequisites, then you just install Newman globally and you're good to go. So the API that I'm talking about here is inspired by a couple guys I worked with on the Air Force project, Sam Larco and Phil Twang. They have a very nice framework that they've built up, but they had one really nice PowerShell function that we relied upon heavily, and that was to get a resource name in Azure. So whatever kind of resource it is, whether it was a VM, a VNet, a resource group, whatever, we had a very reliable function that had rules in it about our naming conventions so that you would send in a few parameters and it would kick back to you the proper resource name, which I find very valuable. So it occurred to me that you could also maybe create just a real simple function in Azure that did the same thing so that it was accessible to lots of people, not just developers. So maybe there's some people who just create things in the portal and they're like, oh, gee, how do I name this thing? Well, if we had a little API that they could easily call, they could just send in a couple parameters, get back the proper resource name. This one's very easily accessible. You can lock it down with the key, of course. The demo that I have is not locked down. And like I said, you could use it in PowerShell or in a run book or whatever, as long as it's a RESTful API. So it kind of works like this. The example is that you get a resource group name. Here's what the request would look like. The base URL inside these double curly braces is an environment variable that we'll get into later. And so here's the base URL, resource names, and then in particular, I want to get the name of a resource group. And so I'm sending in some other parameters, what region, whether it's gov or commercial, what environment, and it will spit out just in plain text. There's no JSON involved here, it's just plain text from this API. It'll spit out the proper name of that resource group. So I'm going to switch over then and show you kind of the Visual Studio Code structure before we get into actually running the tests. So let's switch over to Visual Studio Code. And again, this is just a very simple function app. And just to show you the extensions that I have installed, the main one that you need is this Azure Functions extension for Visual Studio to work with Azure Functions. But it's very easy in Visual Studio to start up a new project and create a function app. So this is just a function app. There's only one C# class in here. It's called getResourceName. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time kind of talking about functions necessarily, but this is just a static class called getResourceName. And within that class, I have two functions. One is to get resource group name, and then I have another one that's get VNet name. And later on, we'll add one to get a VM name. So then within this project, I have a tests folder. So what I'll show you here soon is that you can run your test in Postman, but then you can export a Postman test collection, and you can export environment files. So really what these JSON files represent here, this one represents a collection of tests, and I'll just show it to you. It's just a bunch of JSON. Like, in Postman, it's really easy to create your test, but at the end of the day, this is what gets created, a JSON file. And then these two files that end in env, these are environment files. And as you can see, like this one, it says demo local, I have a value here for the root URL, which is localhost. When you run a function app locally, it runs on port 7071, and so this would be my base URL. And then I have one for Azure because I already published this function app to Azure. So when I'm testing it in Azure, then my root URL is this one, newmandemo.azurewebsites.net. So these are the three things that Postman spits out, and I'm actually having them be part of my project. So that's the structure of the project. Let me go back to my slides here. So what I want to show you is that, simple Postman requests. I want to show you collections and folders if you're not familiar with them. How to use variables, like I mentioned, your base URL variable that I'm using in this demo. And then we'll actually run the get resource group tests. We'll run them locally. I'll show you the Postman tests. In Postman itself, there's a collection runner. There's a Postman console, and I'll show you how you can export a Postman collection. So first of all, let's go back to Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to go ahead and run. So I'm going to go to my debug window and attach the debugger. So you notice that this little tab pops up, and now it's starting up the functions runtime here in Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to wait till this all completes, and then at the very bottom of this terminal, we'll see that what my endpoints actually are. So there will be two endpoints here because I have two functions. Seems like it's taking a little longer than normal.
That's because it's a demo.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Okay, here we go. All right, it usually runs faster than this. I wonder if it's because I'm on a Teams meeting here. Could be. So at the very bottom, you can see I have two functions running, two HTTP functions. These are my endpoints. I have one that's resource group and one for VNet name. And you can see that this is the full URL. So when you switch over to Postman, these are the requests that you're going to make, just simple gets. You can do posts, puts, whatever with Postman, but we're just going to keep it to simple gets. So now let's actually switch over to Postman. And here I am in Postman, and let's just talk a little bit about the structure that I have going on here. So what I have at the very top level here is a Postman collection. You can see that there's a total of 7 requests. And within a Postman collection, you can have folders. So I have a folder for resource group. So these are the tests I'm going to run for getting a resource group name. And then I have a folder for VNet. And these are the requests that I'll run for getting a VNet name. So right now, let's just start with a clean slate. Let's go into resource group and let's take a look at this first get. So over here on the right side is where the environment selection box is. So right now I want to run against local. And what I'm sending in are just values for all the different parameters. You can see the whole thing up here. And I'm just going to send this GET request. All right, so I hope you all can see this. Let me just blow this up a little bit. There we go. So this is the response that I got back from my API call. And we can see that it was at 200. That's all well and good. Another thing that you can do in Postman, I don't know if you guys know this, but if you press Control-Alt-C, that brings up a console. like this, that will keep track of your request. So if I'm going to move this and down to my other screen, run a different request, and then we'll examine it in the console. So I'll send that another request. I got the response, and here's the result in the Postman console. You can see that it tracked that GET request. And we can actually see here, what the base URL was. And we can see the results in the console. And this is also a good way to write out like any log statements that you want to log out if you're actually running a test and you have some log statements in your test. So you can also, another thing that's valuable to do with Postman tests is to make sure that you're getting back a nice error message when you're sending a bad request. So in this case, I'm not sending any parameters in at all. So let's see what happens in that case. Okay, 400 bad requests. And this test passed. We can see that the test results are 1 test and it passed. That's because in my test, I actually have it. I'm expecting a 400. So this is how you write tests for Postman. I'm going to get into a little bit of the Postman sandbox a little bit later, but you can run all kinds of tests. You can have pre-request scripts that run, and then post-request you can run a test. And as you can imagine, you can get quite detailed about the expected response. Okay, so that's running it from the Postman UI. Let's get back to our slides here to make sure I'm still staying on track. Okay, so collections and folders, we talked about that. Variables, so I talked about the environment variable. Again, when you're using these, you can use this base URL as your base variable, and that comes from this environment file. If you want to take a look at what's in that environment file, I only have one variable in here that's base URL, and it's pointing to the local host. So that's how to use environment variables and environment files. Okay, so ran it, Postman test, collection runner. Okay, collection runner. So I only ran 1 test, but if you want to run all the tests in a collection, Postman has this runner. And this allows you to choose a collection. I only have 1 collection right now. And it allows you to choose your environment file. So again, I want to run it against local. And now let's just run all of those requests. So you can see that I believe there's 7 requests total. And 7 passed, 0 failed. So that's the collection runner. I showed you the Postman console. Okay, so then how do you get this stuff into Visual Studio, into my project, my repository? So you have this collection. Here's an ellipse that if you drop this down, there's an export menu item. And you can go ahead and export this collection. So, oh, this is pretty small. But basically, you can just export that JSON. And what I'm doing here is just then placing it in my repository where all my other code is under the test folder. So that's how you export a collection and save it locally or save it in a repository. The same thing can be done for an environment file. So you come over to your environments, and you can see I have 2 environment files. And basically, you just click on this download button, and the same kind of thing happens. This produces the JSON file. So then I save it to my repository. So there's not really any great Git integration with Postman yet, as far as I know. So that's the best way to kind of work with source control is, author your tests in Postman, author your environment files in Postman, and then export them out and save them locally and put them in a repository. Okay, back to the slide. Okay, that's exporting a Postman collection. Good. And all right, environment variables. I showed you how to do that with your double curly braces and a URL. And environment files, I already talked about that, so we're good there. Okay, so again, I mentioned that I was going to talk about the Postman sandbox. So how does this all work? Postman has its own execution environment that they call the Postman sandbox, and it's based on Node.js. So there's this PM JavaScript object that you can use in your scripts to get data about your request and get data about the response. And then after you get that data, you can use a JavaScript library called Chi and Chi expressions to test against expected values. So what are we doing here? Here's the PM JavaScript object that I was talking about and this test method. The first parameter is kind of the name of your test, and that's what will show up in your test results. And then it expects a function. And so within that function, we're saying, I want to get the response from that Postman object, and I expect it, this is the Chi assertion, to have status. And then you can say, I expect it to be okay, 200. And then you expect the response to be a string, because I mentioned that it's not JSON. If it were JSON, we could say to be JSON, but we're just doing string return value. And then you can do an expect, and you can actually say that I want the response text to equal this value. Okay, this is what I expect to get back. So that's how you write the tests in Postman. And you saw an example of that. So now how do you use Newman to test an API? So again, we can do this from the command line, which is what gets us what we need in Azure DevOps. So I'll show you how to do this in Visual Studio Code. So it's pretty simple. The command goes like this: Newman run, and then the name of your collection, and then you give it the name of your environment file. So of course I have a local host environment file, and I have an Azure one. So an example would look like this: Newman run, and your collection file and your environment file. So let's go back to Visual Studio and try that. So I already have a PowerShell window up here, and let's clear the console. So here we have, we're saying, go ahead and run this collection against this environment file, and then you can optionally tell it what folder to run against. So I'm going to take that out and go ahead and run it. It kind of, okay, there we go. So now you can see that I'm getting the same number of results that I got in Postman because I ran the whole collection. It gives you your individual results for every request, and then a nice little summary down here that there were 7 executed, none of them failed. So that's how you can run it in Visual Studio locally. And then, of course, when we step out into Azure DevOps, we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to see results in Azure DevOps. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, I talked about the project structure. My Newman tests are in a test folder. And then I also showed you how you can export your test collections and your environment files from Postman. So we already did that. That's good. And now we get to the fun part, right? So if you're following along so far, you know how to run Postman, create tests, run against localhost. You could even run against Azure once it's deployed locally. But now this is the fun part, because what we're going to be doing in Azure DevOps is we're going to have a build pipeline and a release pipeline. So what's the build pipeline do? The build pipeline will run automatically when there's an update to our master branch. It's going to build the C# function app. It'll publish the artifacts for the function app and to the actually Azure pipeline. And then it'll publish artifacts for the Postman tests. So my Postman tests are in the tests folder. So it's going to publish 2 different artifacts. And then we'll have a release pipeline, and that's going to create a new release on every successful build. So when this build pipeline succeeds, we're going to have a release created, and the release will have 2 stages to it. The first stage will actually deploy the function app to Azure. And then the second stage, after the function app's deployed, we're going to run Postman tests against that deployed API and make sure that everything's good once it's out there. So that's the idea. So let's just take a real quick look, because this is the meat of it. Take a real quick look at Azure DevOps. And let's take a look at our pipelines. So this is just my MSDN subscription. And I have a pipeline that I called Newman Demo Pipeline. Let's take a look at what's going on here. Those of you that have experience with Azure DevOps, this is no big deal. We're just using tasks within Azure DevOps and doing a build task, and then with the tests, we're just going to zip them up and publish them. And this is also taking a very long time. Okay, so we're doing two things. We're building the function app, publishing it just like you would normally. And then the second step is actually publishing to a second drop location, and we're calling it test drop. That's so that, when we publish these things out to the Azure pipeline, in the next step in release, we know where we can grab these things separately. So then we have a release pipeline. And let's edit this. You can see that this ran this morning, and we had successful stages in deploy and test. And let's take a look at what's going on here. Okay, so again, this is a continuous deployment trigger. When my build happens and the artifacts get created, then I'm going to create a new release. And then when the release gets created, there's two stages. This first stage is just simply deploying the function app. So this is just out of the box, deploy function app to Azure. And once that completes, then we're going to move on to the test stage. And this is where we run the Newman tests. So we're just using an out of the box Azure DevOps build agent. And so what we have to do is exactly what we did to set up Visual Studio Code on our local machine. Like, this is a brand new agent. It doesn't know anything about NPM or a Newman. So basically, we have to come in here and do an NPM install Newman. And I'm telling it actually which version to use. And then this next command is where you can see this. I hope you can. I'll blow it up a little bit. Okay. So you can see that what we're doing here is doing the same kind of command that we did in Visual Studio Code. Newman run, and we're giving it the test to run and the environment file. And this time we're running it against the Azure environment file. And then there's these little reporter flags that allows you to report out the results. And we'll use these results, these XML results, within the DevOps pipeline to show you a nice, concise version of your results. And then the last thing is that you publish those results. So you can see here, I'm grabbing what I produced in that previous step right here. And then all the magic happens, really. I mean, it's like you get to see the results very nicely. In fact, if I go back to my pipeline and my release, I'll show you right now what it looks like in case we run out of time, because it's 12:30 already. Okay, so here's one that worked this morning. We'll click on this test stage, and you can go to the tests tab here. This is normally very fast. Okay. And here you go. So I had 7 total tests, 100% pass percentage, and this is how long it took to run. So, that's good. If you had some failures, you could configure DevOps to maybe send you an email or send a Teams message or something like that. That's kind of what we did in my last job, is we alerted ourselves when there were failures to the API tests. So that's what it looks like when you're all done. So let's go back to the slides and make sure we're staying on track here. So what I'd like to do with remaining time, it's 12:33. I'd like to actually create a feature branch and put in there a function that gives me the proper VM name. So I'm creating a VM. I want to get the proper name that I need for it. So I need to add that. And then I need to add some Postman tests for it, run the tests, and go through the whole development cycle, completely down here to where I'm pushing it out, I'm creating the PR, complete the PR, and then everything will run automatically, and we should see our test results. So let's go into our Visual Studio Code, and I already created a branch. So I created a branch called VM name. So now if I go into my get resource name class, I should see another function. So we have get resource group. This one is get VNet name. And now this is get VM name. So now I have a third function. And what I want to do is create some Postman tests against get VM name. So I'm going to first run this. Attach the debugger. And while that's running, starting up, I'll go over to Postman UI. And what I'm going to do is create a new folder. So I have resource group, I have VNet. Let's create a new folder. And let's call this one VM. All right. So now what's very easy to do is to let's just take one of these existing tests and we'll just modify it. So we're going to duplicate this guy. And now you can just drag and drop. So I duplicated that test. I'm going to drag it into the VM folder and rename it. In fact, these should probably be named a little bit differently. They should be named, let's just call it VM underscore, like that. Okay. So now I have to change this a little bit. Instead of going to the VNet endpoint, I'm going to be going to the VM endpoint like this. Okay. Now my test has to change too. In fact, it's probably a good exercise to just run this test and see it fail. Because the expected value right now, since I copied this thing, is actually spitting out the expected VNet name. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Let's make sure that this thing is running. Okay. Looks like it is. I don't know that it is actually. Let's try that again. Ah, previous one was not stopped, I guess. Let me just kill these guys here. So again, we should be seeing 3 endpoints this time instead of just 2. And I'm probably going to have to start fast forwarding some of this work here. So we'll just create a couple tests in Postman, and then we'll just take care of the build, the merge, and all that kind of stuff to see it produce what we want it to produce. All right, come on, 3 functions. And again, it's not usually this slow. So there's the 3 functions. Now we have one with the VM endpoint. So now we can go over to Postman, and we're on the local environment, and we're going to send this request, and it should fail. And it did, because we didn't change this expected value here in the test. So since we got back this value, we're just going to copy that to make it easy. Go into our test, and let's put that value in. I expect this to be spit out. And we should probably change the name of the test to match. Okay, and we called that food, didn't we? Okay, so let's save it, run it again. All right, this time it succeeded. So all we did was add one test. We added the test for VM. We're going to stop right there. And this is the point at which we want this to get into source control now. So what are we going to do? We're going to export this collection. We're going to overwrite the test that we had in here before. I'm sorry, this is so small. We're actually saving it. It already exists. Do I want to replace it? Yes. So now what happened? If we go over to Visual Studio, we should see in our source control window that, yep, those tests got updated. So first of all, let me just stop this from running and disconnect the debugger. And let's go ahead and check this in. So we're checking it into this branch called VM name. We're saying we added test for VM name. Okay. Check that into our local repository. Then we're going to push it. Okay. Just going to push that out to Azure DevOps, to our repository. So let's switch over in the meantime while we're waiting for that to happen. So here's my repo. Okay, you updated the branch just now. Good. So let's create a pull request. And VM name. And I don't think I need to do anything else. Let's try this. So I want to merge it into master. No merge conflicts. I'm going to go ahead and complete it. Okay, so now what's happening? The merge is happening. My master branch should be updated. So if I come in here to my branches, should see my master branch. Status is in progress, I guess. So the merge is still taking place. But now what should happen is if we go to our pipeline, we should see our build kick in. And then after the build happens, we should see our release. And then at the end of the day, we should see 8 tests that actually happen because we added one Postman test that's testing the VM name. So this is going to take a few minutes. Let's just first of all get ourselves where we need to be. And that's here. Okay, you can see that in progress, this build pipeline is running. And in the meantime, are there any questions while we're waiting for this to complete now? We're at 12:44.
Seems pretty straightforward, to be honest.
Okay, good.
I think I have a philosophical difference between testing it through an API versus something else, but that's another story.
Do you mean testing with Postman versus something else?
Well, I don't like to put that much business logic in my protocol translation layer. That's all. You know what I mean? Like, I just think that business logic like that should be in something that's more portable than in the actual protocol translation layer, which is what the functions are. But I know people are going that direction, and that's why I say it's a philosophical problem for me.
Right. So getting back to that, I wanted to keep this really simple. So when in my last, so you're talking about the API in general, right?
Yeah, basically.
Not so much Postman. I totally agree with you. So when I was at my last job, when I came on board, their API was totally built on functions, which drove me nuts. There was so much logic in the functions, and I thought that was inappropriate. So what we did over like a year and a half was we moved to a .NET Core API and had very lightweight controllers, and most of our logic was in like the business tier in a service layer. And I totally agree with you. So like this is not something I would do ordinarily.
Yeah, okay. All right, so then what we would test this might be, did I get a 500? Did I get a 501, a 504? Yep. Did it include the right headers, that type of thing? Just the protocol only, not really. We're testing business logic, which isn't necessarily what you would do. Okay, I got it. We're on the same page. Cool. That's good to know.
Yeah. Okay, so looks like 3 minutes ago, the build worked. So now we could go to releases. Okay, so it looks like the deployment worked. So the first stage, deploy succeeded. So we got the function app deployed to Azure. Just to show you, it's a very, very lightweight function, and it's in the consumption plan, so it doesn't cost you, money except when it runs. So that's why I thought that this might be something valuable in the future projects where we know it's not going to cost a lot of money. It's on a consumption plan. So let's go back, and it looks like everything succeeded. So here we got the steps. We downloaded the artifact. We deployed the function app, and then we actually ran the job. So that's the deploy stage. And the test stage is still running. So the Newman tests are running now in that stage. And this is a good timing. We have about 10 minutes left. So all my tests are checked into source control. My new code was checked into source control. And my tests are now running. So should be good. Okay, it looks like the run worked. Yep, okay. So now if we go to tests, there we got 8 tests that passed, 0 failed. My master branch is up to date. The API was deployed, and I tested my new endpoint. So that's kind of the SDLC of using Postman tests with an API and then testing after the API gets deployed. So any other questions or comments?
I guess that would be pretty useful, I think.
Yeah, no, yeah. Again, like we combined this with unit tests, right? We had a lot of logic in a business service layer that we covered with unit tests. But then we also wanted to just have these kinds of tests to more like smoke tests on the API to make sure that, yeah, everything worked locally, but now when it's published out to Azure, are all the endpoints working the way they're supposed to work? Are we getting appropriate error messages back or appropriate response codes with a bad request? Those kinds of things with an API, I think, are very important to test and know that they're working. Like not just the success story, but all of the bad requests that could happen.
Yeah, I think a tricky part would be that you can't decouple dependencies, right? So if you're calling a third-party service, that could be hooked up, or I suppose your config in that area may have a way to not do that, right? So there's some more considerations in terms of that. That's tricky, but can be overcome, you know?
Right.
It's still super useful.
I have a question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Well, two questions. One, can this be, since it's a node-based API, can it be extended outside of Azure? Because I'm working on a project right now with MuleSoft. They're using to like manage all their gateway interaction in their APIs. So are these test cases able to be like integrated with Jenkins and run that way?
I would think so. So I have just a little bit of experience with Jenkins, but you know, the fact that, you know, it's just a command line tool, it should be able to be used from a Jenkins build agent as well, as long as you have enough control of that build agent to, you know, run npm install Newman, then you should be good. And if you have a dedicated build agent, that's even better because you can take control of that yourself.
Okay. The other question is, with this API, are there, I know you just did a simple GET request, but are you allowed to implement like any sort of like advanced headers, or because I've run into issues too where like a lot of the server errors we've been getting on the project I'm on right now, when they do a backend update, it causes a bunch of header errors, whether it's origin or CSPs or what have you.
So are you saying that you want to modify the header before you would send a request?
Yeah, are we allowed, like, is it extensible like that?
That's a good question with Newman. You know, with Postman, you can kind of modify your headers.
Yeah. I use Postman, but I like the automation idea of this for the backend development.
And that's a good question. I have not tried that. But I mean, when you're modifying your requests, you know, you're in Postman here, and let's say that you're modifying a request somehow, and you're maybe adding some headers. You can actually, once you get that to execute in Postman, then it's just a matter of exporting that. That becomes part of your JSON file, right? You export that to JSON, and that's all part of it. So if you can get it to work in the UI and save it and export it, then it should work with Newman. You shouldn't have to do anything different with Newman.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, this is Selvi. I don't have a question, but I just want to comment this. This is very important. When we move from DevOps to DevSecOps, when you introduce many security tools, the only way to call them to leverage is through their API. They have UI and all, but the API. So this is very important point when we move to DevSecOps. So, but this is great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, and these tests can get very complicated. I mean, they can get very, very long. I mean, if you have an API and you're doing posts and puts and gets and deletes, I mean, you can imagine kind of the complicated tests that you might have where, you know, you might do a post, and then if you get a response, depending on the way the API is built, if you get a response that includes an object with it, the created object, you might want to go through all the properties of that object and make sure that they're correct. And then if you have very large objects, just on a simple get, you might have a lot of properties to check.
Just to point out, Salvi's doing a DevSecOps presentation October 7th, I think is what I have it down for. Yeah, no, oh, yeah, October 7th.
Yeah,
So
right. Yeah.
if you want to know what that means and why this ties into that, then tune in about a month and a half.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay,
Thanks,
sure.
Terry.
Sure.
Anything else?
No, I'll make these slides available if you show me where to put them, Steve. And I have some references here at the very end on kind of like the Postman sandbox, that Kai assertion library, getting started, and managing environments. I have references to all those things.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Informative, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending. Appreciate it.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Terry.
thank you very much.
Yep.